new symbiosis. For instance, when humans appear in a territory and they create a new metabolism between some human garbage, animals eating. I mean, there's certain new interactions which are not stabilized over thousands of years, emerge in kind of feedback loops and crystallize a kind of functional system.
Yeah.
Temporarily. But the other thing is illnesses.
Yeah.
So,
I was thinking cancer, for example.
There's this kind of famous book, The Normal and the Pathological, by Canguin. It's a French philosopher of science, which was influential book in the 90s on these. We discussed these kind of issues with delusion virtually. So then when you have an illness and some kind of certain organs fall out, other organs pick up, we as humans also are able to compensate for deficiencies with additional aids, with medication or crutches or prostheses. I mean, that's okay, that's again the human example, because we have the most adaptive and versatile, but also the body itself creates new metabolisms which are not meant to be.
Yeah, physical adaptation.
And therefore they find there's new kind of metabolism, meaning systems of interaction which still are functionally integrated, but not organisms in the sense of having evolved for the purpose or having the features. So at that point you have fellow features or morphological structures or features which are just side effects of what they've been selected for becoming vital. They're not part of an organism. They're not proper functional organs because they are not selected for their effects. The effects emerge as in assemblages. So I would be able to, but again, it's a good question, but it's not so important for the design philosophy.
Speculation.
Yeah. So just looking, found a new example of what we could talk about assemblages. Although these are just images, but obviously various elements fulfill certain unexpected vectorial functions and the way they. I mean, last time we discussed the principle of the complementarity of parts, or like Cuvier talked about in his kind of comparative anatomical morphology research, principle of correlation of parts, and he was going very far with this, thinking that so these are different horses, and there's a kind of correlation or a dependency relationship between these, depending on the size and so on of the horse and its habitat. So there's a sense of complementarity and proportionality, which supposedly allows the inference from one part to all the other parts. That's an exaggeration, obviously, but in highly evolved organisms there is some degree that's possible. So I just wanted to mention that, and it's in a sense like a parametric model, because you have this principle of complementarity is basically what we call associative logics, where you have dependency functions from one part to all the other parts, and that only implies some kind of optimizing, relative mutual optimization. So that, for instance, when you have a more slender slab with less loads, you can make the column slenderer. So the proportionality, you don't have to. So it's not that it's for an optimized system you would kind of tease, and that's what nature would do, tease out all these redundancies. So then you have this kind of proportionality of the elements, which is a kind of outward sign of complementarity, which is a more profound notion, complementarity of interaction towards a functional requirement, a set of performance criteria. So functional integration, complementarity of parts, then translates on the level of dimensions, for instance, to something like dimensional dependency relationships, which we model in parametric models or in associative models. And like in these, of course, species, there is a complete mapping from one model to the other, from one subspecies to other, or from one race of forces to another. You usually don't gain or lose parts. Like in a parametric model, you don't gain or lose parts. There's a topological coherence. It's similar with morphing. When you have a morphing series, there's a kind of topological unity. Now, something very similar has evolved in architecture with these. So you have these kind of classical orders, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and then there's a composite. And originally they were thought, obviously, first of all, they have a kind of mapping of all the parts. Nearly all the parts occur in all of them. And then there's a very strict proportionality. But you can see once there's an empirically researched from individual temples, you can see that there's variation. So there isn't the Doric exactly one. It was later formalized as one at a certain stage. The Ionic had certain set proportions of, first of all, the column itself, the intercolumn, and then every detailed part. So there was a one-stage system, but empirically it wasn't true. In the 19th century they realized, and the word empirically, that these canonized systems of proportions weren't actually empirically there, they were idealizations. But still, the system is very similar to this. There's a kind of set of parts, and then there's a proportionality across. But in this case, there's no. There's a proportionality within each, also, not only from one to the other, but these are scalable. That's very different from nature. And this would obviously is only possible within certain limits. But strictly speaking, the Dressel orders had set proportions, and whether you make a very small temple or very large, they would be identical proportions. You would just proportionally scale up within each. And obviously that is not really viable if you would go beyond a certain range of scales, just on the side. So if you compare a mouse and an elephant, they're not just proportions change because gravity is a much more stronger force in a larger animal. And anyway, so that there is a definite similarity between this kind of research and way of mapping and charting with respect to the emerging zoology, biology, and anatomy. There's a similar logic going on. Also, because it was so kind of stereotyped into these organisms so in terms of this concept of organism, the Greek temple is an organism, the whole classical building is an organism in this sense. And then you have let's say, different species which are very strict in the elements which constitute them and the precise proportionality of these pieces to each other. Never mind that empirically in the Greek examples, and Roman examples were measured, there was variation. It became a kind of very, very strict system. So that all of these dimensions are relative to each other, precise. And you can go to the nth degree of developing these details. But also, as earlier, there is a kind of, although there are some elements like the tree glues which are only in the Doric, etc., there's a certain set of terms which apply across the whole range of species. In this sense, there is, and it's, yeah. So, the next concept I wanted to introduce is that concept from biology, which distinguishes homology and analogy as two ways of relating different species, organisms, to each other. So it's a very, very common topic, and I think it can be very well also applied to analysis of designed artifacts. Right? So in terms of the homologies, it's basically that you can make a mapping of bones from, for instance, a dolphin to a chimpanzee, nearly kind of one-to-one mapping where all the elements are there, just in totally different proportions, and also now with a very different function. But they retain, as they evolve, their organizational structure and topology. It's much more stable, and usually evolution finds it hard to change that, but can go very far in changing this kind of
Excuse me, is it possible?
The functionality and the visual form of the piece. Yeah.
Is it possible to ask the question, like, does this picture imply that actually in both cases these two species have the same root of these bones? So basically it's the same, like they had a common...
common ancestry.
Yeah,
definitely. So the human cat, whale, bat, so you can see through the color, which you can identify, you can name that it's the same nomenclature of bones reoccurs through all of these different, even though you have a very different function, and that's the point here. That although you have a wing and the for flying, a fin for swimming, a leg for walking, and the hand, they're very, very different selection criteria and functions and operations, but they all share the same topology. These are homologous structures. Okay, and you'll find that in the design world to some extent as well, because as designers we also find that we often evolve ideas as we have similar structures for new purposes, and we carry on these structures. So I mean, something to you can start thinking of examples of that. Many of these kind of examples. It goes across categories like mammal, reptile, bird. There still maintains, even across these large categories, a homology on the side of the skeleton. And there's certain, you could think of certain principles in architecture, certain types of connections which could appear in all sorts of conditions, buildings, scales, nuts and bolts and so on, plates. So this is another of these examples. And obviously there's the homology, but suddenly something very different in terms of the interaction and relative, the overall function and also relative function, and differentiation happens. So there are many of these kind of examples. And then happens something where this is no longer pure, so you have certain kind of the number of elements changes, an element is lost, becomes maybe disappears as a rudiment, they fuse, which is also happening possible. Now, the other thing is that you have what they call analogy, is when you have, so the homology is you come from one root and you disperse over very different functions but maintain the same structure. The other is you're coming from very different roots with very different systems and organizational structures, and you converge because you have the similar functional criteria working on. So there's a certain these wings have similarities, although the underlying constitution is very different in terms of the insect wing, the bird wing, and the mammal, kind of the bat. And obviously that also happens when you have different system creating roofs, for instance, or skeletons with very different materials, with very different types of details, etc. You have analogy operating. And these are, I think, helpful distinction and categories to analyze the world of artifacts. It's an extended analogy between built construct and organisms versus assemblages. So this is another one of the analogies. Again, the insect, bat, wings with feathers. So they have the same selection pressure, the same or similar functional conditions operating on them, and then their different origins converge into a structure. So last time we kind of stopped here, and the few slides I'll just put together for now. By the way, is there any question on this kind of distinction, analogy, homology? I mean, I have a thought. You could start thinking of more examples of this stuff. Now this one is very important. The distinction between exaptation and adaptation. Adaptation is the more well-established principle of evolution, where you have kind of an optimization process where an organ, once it starts to fulfill a certain function, improves in doing that gradually as it adapts to these constraints. Then further, if there's a slight difference in the environmental condition, it then kind of tracks that and adapts to this. But the idea here is that you have some kind of optimization process along a relatively stable or only quantitatively varying life condition, and therefore a set of functional criteria. That's adaptation. That's what usually exaptation is, something where an organism starts to use some of its structures and organs in unexpected ways, facing a new condition, and the structure wasn't gradually improved to reach that, wasn't selected for that, but is accidentally able to pick up a new capacity, and because circumstances have changed. At that point, you call that feature an exaptation, or here a pre-adaptive advance, and that's something also I think we find very, very much in design, and it's pertinent for the assemblages, because there, when you draw things together which have evolved or been designed for one purpose, they have capacities which can be brought to bear on a new configuration for a new purpose and function. At that point, these capacities, they are well adapted to these new purposes, but there was a pre-adaptive advance in the sense that these capacities were there prior to that their utilization. So there's a pre-adaptive advance, and that's happens. This concept you can use it in biology, you can use it in social evolution, also in human institutions. There are many examples of that, also in the development of artifacts. So this is steps back from this concept for a moment and talks about this evolution where you actually where something is switching mode of existence, like here's the idea of vertebrae moving from the water into a kind of wet land conditions and ultimately onto land. There is again there is this kind of necessity obviously to do that with the structures you have, and then there is so there are to some extent there is these things that kind of they have pre-adaptive advances to kind of crawl on the ground, even though they haven't been selected and evolved for that. So there have been an adaptation for that, and then the adaptation starts as this new condition is a new selection pressure, and then directs the further evolution. And it again goes through several stages, and you can see in terms of the skeleton that originally these fins were attached to the skull, and they need to kind of gradually break off to gain more flexibility, and you have these things kind of evolving, and in this case there is also topological change involved to some extent. So there is additional elements appearing, and things are severing, but maybe there were kind of points at which that could happen. And then obviously the way back to the water also then happens into something like similar with mammals. They move back. Maybe that is the mammal story. So I found it online. Somebody giving a lecture with this. So even this kind of capacity to fly, the wings, the first rudimentary wings were feathers and so on, were part of a thermoregulation apparatus, which maybe evolved for that, and then somehow evolved under the function of selection criterion of thermoregulation, maybe fanning wind to the animal, I don't know exactly, and then evolved a capacity for flying, which suddenly gave a new level of mobility to that creature, and then that became